So thank you everyone for being here. I'm really happy to have this opportunity and I'm looking forward to the discussion and Q&A after that. So I'm Laïna, you can call me Laïna, and I've been working on ecological emotions for a while. Actually, I have three main flow that drew me towards ecological emotion. One is my own journey. I was an environmental activist as a teenager already. And then my whole life has been about like, how can I care for the environment? How shall we care for the environment and so on? So something very personal and inner. Then through my work, and recently I also started teaching in the last years, and I realized there is so much distress among students when they learn about sustainability, the environmental crisis, and so on. And so this has also reflected on me that how can I teach or how can I approach teaching on communication about the environmental crisis when the data or knowledge that I have to share is actually a trigger for distress. So I think that's the main question there that underlie today's presentation. So yes, I wanted also to have a small trigger warning because I'm going to speak of things that can really lead to distress. I'm also going to mention suicidal ideation on this kind of thing. So please protect yourself. And yeah. These are the kind of data that we see. I also worked for the IPBES a few years ago in communication team. So we were in charge of communicating this kind of data. For instance, 1 million species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction. That's the 2019 global assessment. And this is 1 million out of 8 million. So this data can be very scary and overwhelming. And of course, you probably all know about the climate change, the data of the climate change and so on. So usually this data or this evidence, this knowledge is transmitted just like that. You just give numbers and facts. And that's it. And then we leave people deal with whatever that means for them, whatever that means for their life trajectory and so on. And I think more and more that we should maybe approach communication or teaching in a very different way. Not only giving data and evidence, but also giving tools to how to deal with the emotions that will anyway be associated with a normal response to this kind of data. So that's to give you an example. That's not a quantitative or qualitative survey properly made. It's just to give you an idea. It's a word cloud from students about what they feel about the environmental crisis. So it's students undergrads who take a class, an introductory class to environmental policy. So it's very general. They are not like specifically sustainability students. And these are the kind of words that pop up. And you can see many of these words are quite strong, right? Hopelessness, frustration, despair, anger. It's overwhelming. Some feel guilty, disturbed, destruction, frustration. So there is a lot of very strong words here. And this echoes also many of my conversations with colleagues, students, but also people who just listen to me or read my work and then reach out to me and want to speak. And often what they want to speak about is not that much intellectual, rational things. It's more about how they resonated and how they struggle to deal with the emotions linked with this kind of environmental crisis there. So then we face a methodological challenge. I will not go very deep into that, but that's a key issue when we want to approach emotions, because emotions, they are really like, they are fluffy. It's not really words, right, that I'm talking about. It's about what people feel. And what I noticed is most of the insights I got were not from formal interviews or informal settings. They often emerge spontaneously. It's really people who spontaneously come to me and they start speaking. And that's often when they speak of very deep, almost intimate, very personal aspect. That's the most interesting, I think, the most interesting fluffy part. But it's something that is difficult to approach, even from a research ethics perspective, right? Because if I come to the people and I ask this kind of trigger question, is it really okay to do that? I'm not sure, because it might really trigger distress in them, right? So there is a really, I think, important methodological challenge here on how we approach, how we try to grasp emotions. So most of my work here is actually not based on formal qualitative interviews or anything like that. It's really based on my experience and all the things that people shared with me over the years. And of course, abstract or conceptual research on the literature review on all these normal aspects, normal things. So in the literature, ecological emotions have been defined as the emotional reaction to nature in general. So they can be quote unquote positive or negative. So positive one, they include feelings of awe, admiration, and peace, pleasure. And negative one, they include more what we spoke about today, right? Like eco-anxiety, that is very famous now, or environmental or climate ecological grief, anxiety, despair, and melancholia, or even anger. So this positive or negative, this is just to help us understand easily, but of course you have like crossover, often emotions are mixed, they are often hard to identify, or to express. So this line in between there is really blurred. It's not necessarily even maybe useful for analytical purposes. And so based on all this conversation on the literature review, this is a bit a summary of how I approach emotions related to knowledge about the environmental crisis. So knowledge here is in blue, right? So we learn a new piece of knowledge. It can be reading a paper, watching a documentary, it can be news reports, it can be also your own experience. Like you notice that temperature this year are different than last year, right? You learn something new, and then this increases your worry. And then if your worry is associated with hope, so the hope that we can improve the situation, and then efficacy belief. Efficacy belief is the belief that if I do something, this has high chances to make a change. So there is a pragmatic possibility, efficacy. It can be efficacy to do something, yes. Then this will lead to actions. And if we take action in the world, we will be engaged more and more in the real world. And this in turn will increase our knowledge, right? We will learn more things. And usually what's happening with the environmental crisis is the more we learn about it, the more we realize that it's actually, the situation is worse than what we expected or what we knew about. And so we will increase our worry. And then the challenge here is to remain in this like blue cycle. It's not necessarily all like one after the other like that, right? It's much more messy, of course, but more or less in this blue cycle. Because if we don't remain in this blue cycle, if the knowledge seems overwhelming, if we lose this hope, which is also a form of emotion, right? We might switch to hopelessness and passivity. Here, something important is that the relationship with knowledge is not necessarily positive, right? Because the more we know, the more we're vulnerable to worry and grief. So as people who share knowledge, like teacher or people working in communication, I think we need to be careful with that the knowledge we are sharing is not necessarily neutral and can really be emotionally heavy. So we also need to take care, cultivate hope, and take care of our mental health, engage in long-term environmental actions. On this cycle, I don't think it's not only about like the beginning of when we start to engage in environmental action. It can also affect veterans. Like I had discussion with climate scientists who are in their 60s, who are struggling to remain on this kind of blue cycle. So it's not only about youth. It's about, I think, anyone. And at any stage, I also struggled myself a few years ago to remain in the blue cycle. The question there for me is, one of the questions is as this crossroad there, and that would be how to cultivate emotional resilience there. So what kind of worry are we thinking about? These are a way of defining worry from the literature. I can give you also sources later if you want. So worry can be related to practical questions. For instance, can the level of well-being of this community or our level of well-being be sustained? It can be linked to efficacy or meaning question. Is there any point in being an active citizen at all, considering the resilienceness and complexity of this problem? It can also be linked to ethical question. Is it right to live the way we do in relation to nature and other humans? So in the phrasing of this question, which are like slightly rephrased from the literature, you can already maybe feel the worry, right? These questions are quite dark. So I think the first thing I'm trying to do is to rephrase or reframe the way we approach the problem. to turn this worry into something actually potentially hopeful and practical. So for instance, the practical question can turn into what kind of level of well-being is sustainable and how do we transition there? The efficacy meaning question can turn into what can I do and what can we do? And what are the best leverage points accessible to me? What are the best things that I can do? More efficient things. Ethical question is, for instance, what is the right way to live? And this question has been there, is the core of ethics and philosophy for thousands of years. So it makes it also different, our approach to it, right? It's not less urgent in a sense, and it brings us more to very deep, normal question about the meaning of life, and what we are doing on this planet, or what we are doing in this world, in this life, which are very natural and normal questions for any human being. So, yeah. So another thing there is to help cope with this worry could be to identify our position in relation to different parts of the problem. So, for instance, one of the part of the problem, some parts of this problem we cannot change. Like, for instance, we reach out many tipping points already. There is some part of this climate change that will not be reversible, at least as from what we see in these coming dozens of years. Same for biodiversity loss. Many species are gone, and that's fine. That's fine. That's it. We cannot change anything anymore. Then there are things that I cannot change individually, but maybe that we can change if we do together, but myself individually, there is really little I can do. And then there are the aspects that I can change. These different aspects of the problem they are linked to different forms of emotions, different types of emotions. So the worry would be there in the middle. And what maybe a strategy for me would be to limit what can I worry about, and then what other emotions are associated with different things. What we cannot change, we have to learn to grieve. We have to learn to let go of this. This is ecological grief. And then the hope is the other side, right? What I can change and what we can change if we work together. This area is where we can nurture hope. So if we start to cut this big problem that is overwhelming into small pieces, we can cultivate different forms of emotions or process it with different forms of emotion regarding different subpart of the problem. Leverage point is this kind of thing, right? It's the point for actions or entry point when you have the minimal energy invested on the maximal effect. That's very useful also emotionally because you see the efficacy of your action. But that's also why, not only for the efficacy of like the general sustainability transition, but also emotionally, it's very important, I think, to focus our energy on leverage point. Then ecological grief, we need to learn to grieve for what we cannot save, right? It has 3 dimensions. It's a bit different than the grief for our loved ones, for instance. The dimension of the past is similar. Is someone died, we are to grieve for this person. The same way some species are gone, it's already past, it's finished. So we grieve for it, right? It has a dimension that is present, that has to do with ongoing changes in nature or disruption in nature. So that's the daily life. We need to grieve in the daily life for something that is ongoing. And then it has a dimension that is a bit different from the one we used to, is the future dimension, because we know that major changes in nature will happen. We know that we will lose many species. Climate change will worsen. A lot of our ways of life will not be able to continue, like will be unsustainable, like under a very literal sense. So we need to grieve for many dreams, many hope, many things that we know will happen. Yes. And this is similar or related to the cycle of grief. Maybe you know about this very famous cycle of grief. That's nothing to do with nature or environmental aspect, right? Often we describe grief as going through these stages, not necessarily in a line as well. But it's fascinating because it's very similar to the one we can stages or emotions that we can experience in relation to the environmental crisis. So one of the first reactions people might have is denial. And denial of the severity or seriousness of the environmental crisis can be actually linked to just an emotional response to protect ourselves. Because if we don't deny, then we have to cope with all the emotion associated with this big event, like climate change, for instance. So here I would take an approach of care to people who are in a state of denial, because they might deny just to really literally protect their psychological well-being. It's an avoidance strategy, right? Then you might also have anger. I have some students who express rage, frustration, irritation, like more like violent emotions there. When you try to accept the, okay, this is happening, but then why has no one been doing anything? Especially for younger students, right? Why is all this old generation are putting the responsibility on us, but they have done nothing to face the issue, right? So you might have a lot here. Of course, that's generalized, right? I'm expressing this not as a fact, but as an emotional expression of some people. Then bargaining, we see this a lot, I think. Some people saying, yeah, but this number, for instance, of 1 million species, this might be an overestimation, right? You start to challenge the numbers, challenge the timeline, challenge the data. And that might be also, of course, there is a healthy part of that, right? Like critical mind, but you also might be just a normal emotional process of trying to really make sense of how serious or severe the situation is. Then depression is more like sadness and so on, and struggle to find meaning, struggle to find our own position in it. And of course, acceptance. So here, this cycle, like the cycle before, it's more messy than these cycles. It's just to help us make sense. But of course, the emotions are emerging in non-linear ways often, right? So I will not go into details, but in my previous book there on the concept of milieu, and I worked from Sarah Parkin's view of the positive deviant, and we focused in its different works, but the focus here is how these emotions actually can be protection to avoid taking responsibility. So there is a link between these mechanism emotions and the heaviness that if I accept not only the reality of the environmental crisis, but also the link between the environmental crisis on my life and my actions, then I will have maybe morally to take responsibility for and to change major things. And this might affect, this ethical dimension also influences, I think, the kind of emotional response we might have. The Sarah Parkin is the one who coins the term of sustainability emotional roller coaster. So if you want to have a look on that, it's in her work. Okay, then how do we create hope? All right. Hope there, at least in this tentative work in progress framework, hope is one turning point to build ecological emotional resilience, right? Hope here is informed by science, but it goes beyond. So hope is not just a fantasy, right? It's also fueled by despair and sadness. So it's normal to feel sadness within the hope. Often the hope is emerged from sadness. But it can be very pragmatically forward-looking, and it differs from technological optimism. Technological optimism is this view that some people have that all these environmental problems will be solved magically by a new technology. So it differs from that in the sense that hope is often should, I think, be informed partially by sciences. So it's not about denying the problem. It's not about denying how severe it is, but it's about finding this space there when we still find hope, what we can act on, how we can imagine how things could be different. So it relates to meaning creation, but also to art. And there, I also think that's where art and humanities can fit into sustainability science. Okay. Then there is one of the possibilities that hopelessness and passivity lead to very, very intense emotions and to suicidal ideation. And these last 2 years, I had a few, but already too many people coming to me and describing, and including students, suicidal ideation because they cannot make sense of, they don't see how we can get out of this problem. And then the meaning of their own life is kind of getting lost because the problem is overwhelming. So I'm concerned, I'm worried that this might touch more people than we actually think of. And of course, one of the questions I'm asked when I speak about that is, can I show that this suicidal ideation is uniquely linked to the environmental crisis? Oh, no, I cannot, of course. Most people, they have experienced many different things in their life together. It might be linked with financial difficulties, with difficulties in their personal life, in relationships. And the environmental crisis is more giving a context that is pushing, that is more nurturing distress rather than nurturing peace, right? That makes people feel unsafe. So it's not the only trigger, of course. But then another question for me was, how do we move back from this stage of suicidal ideation to the more positive blue cycle again? So last year's, it's linked with me starting teaching, right? Because I was thinking, how can I teach these things if some of my students start to think of suicide after my class? This is not really okay, right? So I started to take many courses online, and so to read a lot about suicide prevention, mental health, psychological first aid. And these are two of the main theory of suicide prevention, at least in the English-speaking literature. And the pattern on these two theories are similar. So you can see that it's about pain and hopelessness. And if the pain and hopelessness is greater than the feeling of connectedness, we might start feeling very like suicidal ideation, so feeling very helpless. The other theory is also mentioning these two aspects, right? The connectedness, the feeling of I am alone, so lack of connectedness, and then the feeling of I am a burden, so the lack of hope that we can make a positive contribution to the world. So if we flip this negative side into the positive side, it means we need two things, right, to stay away from suicidal ideation. One is we need to feel connected, and one is we need to feel that we can make a positive contribution. We have hope to make a positive contribution in the world. And this was aligned also with more generally across scale. It's a work in progress work, so the table might change and so on, and yeah. But it's a work I'm doing with Laÿna, my colleague, and we analyze different vulnerability and resilience from different disciplines at different scales. And then for me, one of the results from that I did not expect was that resilience across scale was often associated with something to do with connection, like connectedness. The first line is what I described now. Connectedness, social networks, social cohesion, cooperation, interconnectedness. So we see here that this aspect of connectedness might be valid not only at the internal mental health sphere, but also beyond that. So a common thread to resilience at different scale then is this connectedness, right? And here the internal and external aspects, they are not separable. Basically, we cannot feel connected alone. That's pretty straightforward, right? So it also means that emotional resilience cannot be achieved individually. It's really grounded on collective emotional resilience. And that's, I think, very important in how we approach this communication about sustainability. We cannot just leave people alone to deal with their emotion for such a big, huge problem. So that's my very tentative work in progress recipe for ecological emotional resilience. It might still change a lot, right? But you have two aspects, this aspect of connectedness and hope. The aspect of connectedness, it's to others, but also maybe to nature, to other species and so on. And we can cultivate that through storytelling that nurture positive, mutual emotions. And then hope is also about cultivative narratives and worldview that carry hope. So when we share this information, for instance, about the environmental crisis, it's not only about scaring people or shocking people, but we also need to associate some dimension of what kind of worldview can be hopeful. And as I mentioned before, this ecological emotional resilience cannot be individual, so it needs to be collective. So we need to think about that collectively, together. So these are some of the points, right? How we communicate and teach sustainability matters. And we need to communicate with care, simultaneously sharing tools to cope with the emotion associated with the knowledge. And then the last point here I wanted to make was, especially for students or even for youth in general, and even for myself, it's not about the future, it's really about the now. Like, it's not only about the climate, something that's far, or biodiversity, or the forest, or the ocean. It's also really basically about life, about our own life and our life trajectory. And that's very clear when you look at this picture. It's from the last report of the IPCC. Depending on where you are in your own life trajectory, you will experience this kind of knowledge in a very different way, and that's totally normal. Like, if we are born around the 90s, 2000s, then this question here, they emerge at a point when we have to make decisions about our own life. What kind of job I will have to do? Do I want to take part in the financial capitalist things or not? Do I want children or not? Will I get married or not? Do I want an urban lifestyle or different lifestyle? All these question this decision that we have to take about our own life, the young people, we have to make them in the context of very scary, overwhelming environmental crisis. So how we teach about the environmental crisis or we speak about it needs, I think, to really take into consideration this thing, that we need to care for the people who are listening. One of the dissonance here is this kind of question there. It's a bit too long, but how can we envision our own life when the dominant narrative and discourses are making political claims and imposing sociocultural expectations that are incompatible with maintaining the most basic possibility of a human life? And I think that's many of my students and very many of my colleagues, we are facing this kind of issue, right? Our parents or like the dominant narrative is about, for instance, having a very carbon emitting lifestyle, right? That is incompatible with maintaining the possibility of life. So how can we make sense of our own life in this context? So there is a feeling, or there is, I think, even concrete disconnection and dissonance between this dominant worldview that's in the discourse, in the media, and so on, and the reality of our own life on daily experience. And I think this disconnect also increases the feeling alone and is a cause of emotional distress. These are, for instance, some of the coping strategies I'm starting to collect with students and with just people coming to me. We find in when I ask them how do they deal with this emotion, how do they cope, you see the very similar ideas, right? Like fiction, escaping in fiction, but also art, music, meditation, finding beauty in nature, experiences in nature, not staying alone, and building community, taking action, volunteer. So these are very bara. They are like very diverse now. One of the things I would like maybe to do is participating in collecting this strategy and sharing like toolbox with different people. These are the takeaway for what I spoke about today. One was maybe we can change worry through constructive rephrasing or reframing. We can identify leverage point to also help us deal with this feeling of overwhelming. And then learn to grieve, but also learn to create hope, and most importantly, to stay connected. So we need to speak about it to each other, to people we trust, and create connectedness, connection. And that's my website. All my references are there on my email, and that's it. Thank you so much for listening.